Welcome virtually to Rhode Island, Dr. Espelage.
How are you?
Where sometimes things run a little bit on Northeast time up here. So we are absolutely delighted to welcome you to the Injury Control COBRA lecture series focused on implementation and dissemination. I am delighted to introduce you and your talk today. So for folks who do not know of Dr. Espelage's work, she is an expert broadly in prevention science, also in school-based intervention, social and emotional learning, bullying prevention, teen dating violence prevention, sexual harassment and violence prevention, and also school-based suicide prevention. Broadly, Dr. Espelage's work focuses on translating empirical findings into prevention and intervention programming, and she secured over $15 million in external funding. She's an advisor to members of Congress and the Senate on bullying prevention and legislation, and she regularly conducts webinars for the CDC, NIH, and NIJ to disseminate research. We are delighted to have her here today to talk about bullying as a developmental precursor to sexual and dating violence across adolescence. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you, Dorothy. Thank you.
It sounds great. This is quite a pleasure to be here presenting this synopsis of a review paper that I did during the pandemic with some colleagues. One of the co-authors is actually joining you guys at Brown University for the T32, so that's Catherine Ingram. So this feels just nice that she's accepted a postdoc there. And now I'm presenting, so it's cool, full circle. I'm glad you accepted her. So I'm going to talk about the bullying as a developmental precursor to sexual and dating violence across adolescence, a topic that was of importance and has been for several decades from my perspective, and certainly Lindsay's shop as well. But I think even more critical given the YRBS data that was released in the last week that showed that females, at least in 2021, 14% of them experienced unwanted sexual assault. So very timely, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. So thank you so much for taking the time this afternoon to listen to me. I did also do this keynote yesterday for the University of Michigan virtual summit that Mark Zimmerman put together with his colleagues there. So hopefully I'll remember to hit all the high points. I will be presenting some longitudinal data that was funded by the Centers for Disease Control, as well as a follow-up to funded by NIJ, as well as some other school-based work that was funded by NIJ. And as you know, any conclusions and findings that I present here are those of my lab and my colleagues and our interpretation of the data, not necessarily the opinions of the federal government. So this isn't anything new. I think for some of you that are younger scholars, you may not know some of Dr. Nan Stein's early work, and I'll allude to this later, on the connection between bullying, sexual harassment, and dating violence. She actually had put together Expect Respect and Bully Proofing Your School in 1997, which was targeting bullying with the hopes that it would then reduce sexual harassment and teen dating violence. But it took a while for this research to really take hold. And so we've been thinking for a really long time in the early 2000s and the late 1990s that we're starting to see some connection. So when I would sit down, I do large scale quantitative studies, but in the early years, we would sit down with kids that were nominated to be those kids that engaged in high rates of bullying. And I recall sitting, interviewing some 7th and 8th graders, just individual interviews, trying to understand what bullying looks like in the US context, because most of that research was coming out of our colleagues across the globe, especially out of Europe. And, many European countries are very different than the United States, just in size itself. And I kept thinking back to my clinical days of when I worked with court-referred domestic violence perpetrators and sexual assault perpetrators, which seems like, okay, that's a bit of a stretch. But the ways in which some of the kids that engaged in high rates of bullying wore it as a badge of honor. It's the ways in which they established dominance, the way they defended their behavior, and the way that they would have the whole entire school kind of keep this code of silence. It just kind of harkened back to some of that clinical work I did with other intimate partner violence perpetrators. And so I kept thinking about that. And then we started with Paul Poteet, who's at Boston College. We started to think about homophobic bullying and homophobic name calling or teasing. And we have to understand too, in that area, Ian Rivers of the UK has been talking about homophobic bullying now over 35 years. So this wasn't anything new, but it wasn't really being discussed in the schools in the early 2000s when Paul Poteet came up with his homophobic content agent target scale. So we decided, so Catherine Ingram is the one that's joining the T32 there. And we decided during the pandemic to really dig into this literature and say, okay, it's not just our lab. I was starting to see Tracy Valancourt's papers come out, especially on the victimization side, looking at the links between bullying, sexual, and dating violence. I started to see Michelle Yabar's papers come out as well, and many others across the country, Jeff Temple, others. I can go on and on. And so it seemed as if we were at a point where we could do a systematic review or literature review. We had tried to do it 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and there simply was just not enough literature. And so this is great. So we spent some of our pandemic time really thinking through the theories behind this potential bullying to sexual violence pathway. We also extended it to dating violence. So I'll talk to you about a study that just came out where the bullying to sexual violence pathway was actually replicated to be the bullying teen dating violence pathway, all pointing to the importance of really thinking about gendered approaches to bully prevention if we're going to reduce sexual and teen dating violence. So I encourage you to go read the article if you haven't. I encourage you to sign it to your classes, talk about it at cocktail parties. But I won't be able to go into all of the details, but I'm going to hit the highlights here. So surprisingly, we found when we looked at 2010 to 2021, 505 articles, and that included 17 meta-analysis and systematic reviews. But when we applied our our search protocol, we found that 107 actually fit our criteria. And in most cases, they had to look at the association between bullying or sexual violence, or bullying and teen dating violence, or bullying and homophobic name calling. Because what we do understand is there's places in the United States where you simply IRB will not approve items like the AAUW or other sexual harassment or sexual assault items. So there's great variability depending on geographics and just the oversight of IRBs. And we can talk more about that too, because I think that continues to be a struggle. I'm situated in the South, so I'm very, very cognizant that this work that I did, that I'm going to present some to you, was done in Illinois and probably could not be replicated down here, especially longitudinal and tracking kids, but we can talk more about that. So we explored both the risk and protective factors that might amplify these associations or attenuate those between bullying, sexual violence, and dating violence. And we spent quite a bit of time really thinking about the theories between this link. Unfortunately, the adolescent bullying literature is a little atheoretical in some ways, yet sexual violence and the dating violence literature, I would argue, have really thought through both sociological, psychological, and the socio-ecological model. And so we tried to combine that together. I'll highlight some of those theories, but know that there's more in the article. Okay, so some theoretical frameworks, many of us on this call have really embraced Brofenbrenner in our work and understand and have added to that too, especially as technology is being introduced to the ecologies of our youth. And we look at school level factors, peer level factors, and of course the family context, which is important as you think about the concomitant overlaps of violence, those things that co-occur. I have a Fuller model. So we're talking about the one pathway of a Fuller model that goes back to the family context, and the family violence can sometimes serve as an important context for understanding the relationship between bullying perpetration, and sexual violence and teen dating violence. What we also have implicated and talk about in the review is the presence of emotion dysregulation or anger, alcohol use as a form of coping, or other risky behaviors that co-occur both with bullying as well as sexual violence and teen dating violence. Certainly delinquency, again, that risky behavior, all as predictors of sexual harassment, perpetration, and teen dating violence. And we do highlight some of those potential moderators in the paper. Since I've been doing this work, and I think it's, I started studying bullying in the early 90s. It was very atheoretical. It was largely situated outside of the United States. It took some convincing of my colleagues that studied aggression that bullying was different. And I continued to see bullying as very gendered, and that embedded within kind of this need for control and dominance and social orientation. And so that's when I started to think about the gendered harassment, sexual harassment, and homophobic name calling. Certainly, this is not new necessarily to think about these types of forms of violence embedded within those situations that reinforce traditional masculinity. Pleck, here I cite it 1995, he was at University of Illinois, wrote quite a bit about sexual harassment and homophobic name calling around this traditional masculinity ideology. And so we really do draw upon these theoretical frameworks pretty heavy in the review. And so I'm going to present some, this is our longitudinal study that was conducted between 2008 and 2013 with kids in middle school, and we tracked them into high school. And I was very, very fortunate to have teachers, administrators, and parents allow us to come in and do a full survey, way beyond like the YRBS one item, but really looking at the AAUW that's been adapted in my lab, as well as the cadre for teen dating violence in the high school years. This was largely the sample of 3,549 across the waves, and largely Caucasian and Black students, given the area was largely Chicago and Central Illinois. We were very fortunate to get a waiver of active consent. Again, that's why we were able to achieve these numbers. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the early some of the early work here that is starting to be replicated in other labs, as I said, Valancourt, Ybarra, and others that are showing this association. Why the delay? The delay was that, as Sherry Hamby will say in her wonderful handbook that I still cite, that many of us in the violence world live in and work and function in silos. So bully researchers would be studying bullying. You could have the sexual harassment looking at sexual harassment, and then you had the teen dating violence or adolescent relationship aggression researchers. And only when we, John Gretchen Hamby said, we've got to break down these silos, did other labs get on board and add some of these measures. And so at this time, when we were collecting the data, we were one of the only labs collecting all three, as well as the homophobic name calling. I'm happy to say that my colleagues, both here in the States and my colleagues across the globe, are starting to add these measures, even if it's a challenge politically, even if it's a challenge with IRB. So this really just set the stage. Backing up, so you'll see these papers are the 2012, 14, a replication of our Colorado data. It was in the Journal of Youth and Adolescence in 19. I'll allude to a paper that just came out that we replicated the extension to teen dating violence, but it really was a 2009 white paper. I remember calling, I forget the story sometimes, but I remember calling CDC or emailing CDC, who I had a relationship with, and it was 2007 or 2008, and maybe it was even 2006 before I got this funding. And what we were noticing during the Bush administration, because only abstinence, sex ed was being promoted, if you will, abstinence, and also there was a real huge pushback for rape prevention education. And I was noticing that the RPEs, the rape prevention educators funded by Centers for Disease Control that were charged to go into schools to prevent rape, were delivering bullying prevention curricula. And sexual assault centers were putting out RFPs for bullying prevention with this idea that somehow we would reduce sexual violence or teen dating violence when in fact they didn't have any of those critical mediators or moderators in the bullying. They didn't even talk about gender-based bullying or homophobic name calling. And that turned into a white paper that was published in 2009 with Kathleen Basile and Merrill Hamburger, who's no longer with us. And that really set the stage for the bullying, sexual violence pathway. Again, so we're 9, do the math, 24 years later, we've got a review article. And so this was a challenge, and in some ways because, well, in many ways, but what was critical is reviewers and editors were really not convinced that homophobic name calling, or those kids calling other kids homophobic slurs, was any really different than bullying. Wasn't that just part of it? So we did a cluster analysis, and this is really a cluster analysis before latent class analysis that showed that consistently in middle school, 12% across a number of our studies, 12% of boys and 12% of girls. And this is when we measured it in a binary manner. So I apologize for that. We've improved, I think, overall in society, that 12% engaged in high rates of bullying, kind of garden variety, if you will, exclusion, name calling, some physical types of perpetration as well. But when we went in and we used Paul Petit's measure and asked them, do you call your friend, someone you don't know, someone you think is gay, these particular names? And you can imagine what those are. When we do a very similar cluster analysis, we find 1 out of 3 boys are high in this cluster, the high cluster group, and 1 out of 5 for the girls as well. And what's interesting about this is that we do know, and there's been sociologists that I've talked about how girls police boys' masculinity just as much as boys police other masculine. So I think in some ways that's the norm. But they weren't convinced, right? They still wanted to see, why wouldn't you just add the items? Isn't it just like, is that different than calling somebody, something related to weight or other types, or your race or ethnicity? So we did this. So Todd Little worked with us to do a really wonderful measurement model that showed very clearly that, yes, they're associated. So you can see the pass, and it was a really good fit, but a two-factor model fit much better, meaning that I was not going to lump them together. I wanted to understand the nuances of homophobic teasing and how it is that kids go from bullying to homophobic name calling, and how can we slow that progression? We put it all together. Anyway, so I convinced them, we got that published, and now many labs are measuring the use of homophobic epithets. So across a series of studies, homophobic name calling is quite prevalent. Our last data collection before the pandemic was spring of 2019. And that was about 6,000 Colorado high school students, and homophobic name calling was more prevalent than garden variety bullying. So it's still out there. The YRBS data that just came out said that bullying is down, but then sexual assaults are up. So we'll have to think about that in the light of this discussion too. So we'll leave some time for that. We have established, as well as the Canadians, that youth who bully resort to homophobic name calling over the middle school years. And so middle school years are really, really critical for points of prevention. Of course, many of us would argue early as possible. This last bullet I have literally had on my slides maybe for 20 years. That says bullying prevention programs should include a discussion of language that marginalizes gender nonconforming and lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth. There has been some improvement in that area. I don't think enough. And to be honest, there's not much bullying prevention going on in our schools now post-pandemic. I'm hopeful that that will change over time if we're starting to pay attention to the YRBS data again, that was in 2021, that's showing high rates of violence experienced by gender and sexual minority youth, as well as females. So we did extend that. So we not only had to show that connection between bullying and homophobic teasing, but also the extension over the years to sexual harassment perpetration. So when we look at sexual violence, we look at sexual harassment perpetration, which is much more prevalent in middle school, so therefore statistically easier to model. But we also talk about sexual contact, and that would be the sexual assault, more difficult because it's so zero inflated. But it's important to think that if you can model it, if you can get a big enough sample to model it, it would be important to do that. And I'll allude to some of our findings in our recent Colorado trial related to sexual harassment versus the sexual assault. It is clear here that when we look, there's a moderating effect between bullying and homophobic name calling that predicts later sexual violence perpetration. And what's important here is as the, even in the, think about the low bullying situation. If I report not bullying very much at all, that would be the solid line. As I engage in more homophobic name calling, that's where we see the push for the sexual violence, where high bullying is associated with the highest rates of sexual violence, but we do see that one kind of modifies the other. It's not an ideal, they don't cross, but if we were to track them over time a little bit further, they might. But it's not only that they moderate, but it's also, we found a multi-mediator. So I've already established bullying perpetration, homophobic perpetration to sexual violence perpetration, but we also find that when you're directing bullying towards others, that you might get some homophobic name calling directed back towards you that then energizes you to display, if it's a heteronormative environment, that you are heterosexual within that context, and you may sexually harass the opposite sex, could be the same sex as well. That is not new. Nan Stein has written quite a bit around this, as well as others that have talked about just how public it is sometimes, but you have to react, because if someone perceives you to be a gender and sexual minority, in some context, you may turn to publicly demonstrating that that is not the case. Also in the paper, we really do unpack a couple of the moderators that many of the sexual violence and teen dating violence prevention programs out there attempt to address, whether it's coaching boys into men, whether it's Green Dot, but thinking about traditional masculinity ideology. So having high rates of bullying and high rates of traditional masculinity ideologies predicted sexual violence perpetration 6 years later. The effect was much stronger for males than females. And so that's important to consider as well, which makes sense because usually when you have measures of traditional masculinity, you're referring to those behaviors that are more appropriate for boys. But we do find that there's an effect there. So when girls do perceive, have a traditional masculinity ideology, along with bullying, there's the uptake in the sexual violence perpetration. But it's also increasingly, we're seeing generations of students that are quite dismissive of attitudes toward sexual harassment. And that is associated with greater sexual violence perpetration. This first 2013 paper was in Journal of School Health, and that focused on the dismissiveness of the teachers, and very disturbing quotes from teachers of blaming the victims of sexual harassment, that girls are bringing this on themselves, which we replicated in 2022. Higher rates of bullying in middle school and high schools were associated with dismissiveness of sexual harassment over time. And we're trying to understand why that is. And there's certainly a number of labs that are showing that, again, that dismissiveness heightens in late middle school into high school. So this was the paper I was talking about where we extended the bully sexual violence pathway to teen dating violence. So I encourage you to, that just hot out of the presses here. So we extended it to teen dating violence. The results showed that that pathway was clearly there. We suspected it was because we really have grounded our work in theory. And when you do that, usually it holds up statistically. So the results indicate that preventing bullying perpetration may be one avenue to reduce TDV perpetration. And should be a priority given the, the slew of subsequent adverse outcomes that's associated with TDV involvement. In that particular paper, we really paid close attention to a sexism scale that we had and homophobic name calling. They both acted as partial moderators between bullying and multiple forms of teen dating violence. So again, addressing that homophobic name calling, that gender-based harassment, as well as sexism within the context of a school. So that was really, we're quite proud of that paper. So when we think about just, and the other things that I've talked about, the Fuller model, we really do have to have this comprehensive approach that addresses the climate that may give potential perpetrators the license to perpetrate. And And how do we diffuse the risk for sexual violence later in high school and emerging adult? And we know this is important, whether it's ad health data or other longitudinal studies, that as we're involved in teen dating violence or adolescent relationship aggression that is associated with intimate partner violence into emerging adults and later adulthood. So it's really critical that we back this up and think about how can we create school climate such that these type of behavior is not rewarded. I said that I would talk about our Colorado trial, and in that particular trial, we're looking at the baseline data of about 6,000 kiddos and 20 high schools there in Colorado. And we did social network analysis. So we asked who their friends were, and then we plotted that out, right? And what we found, and this was published in Prevention Science several years ago, that those perpetrators that just did the sexual harassment and homophobic name calling were quite popular. They were very situated, lots of reciprocated friendships. However, those that were rapists, those that raped, were quite isolated in the network. And that's important because in that trial, we were evaluating sources of strength, which trains peer leaders, right, and it's based on a diffusion model. So if you, much like Green Dot, so if you go in and you train youth leaders as well as trusted adults around messaging of acceptance and help seeking and well-being, then they will go out and do campaigns, and you hope that messaging kind of flows. Now, we didn't specifically talk about sexual harassment, and that was probably a major limitation. But if we're going to continue with the norms approach and these diffusion models, it is likely, and we did show that those sexual assault perpetrators likely did not receive any of the messaging. The exposure was low for them. For whatever reason, that could be their own, so who knows? But thinking about, like, even for many labs that put sexual harassment and sexual contact together, they may be different, and we may want to really think about the nuances of who are those that engage in sexual harassment that go on to rape versus those that don't. And it seems as if sexual harassment is widespread. It was very, very common where sexual assault was less common, although that YRBS data would say that girls, 14% had been sexually assaulted in the prior year before 2021. So something to think about, and certainly if you have any thoughts, I welcome them. If I'm thinking about this, I just would really like some feedback. So, and I will say again that we have to think about how can we create programming in schools or communities or where the youth is to counteract the perceptions of gender nonconformity. And I've been saying that for a really long time, and it seems as if in 2023, I have to say it even more given the attack on gender and sexual minority youth, as well as educators, a population in general. We have to think about the multiple contexts. We identify in the review longitudinal predictors, mediators, moderators, some of them more amenable to prevention prevention targets than others, some more developmentally appropriate, say for late elementary school, middle school, and high school. And we can talk about the challenges with doing this work. And bullying prevention programs need to incorporate gender-based name calling, sexual violence, and gender expression if we want to move this needle. And we have a lot of work to do. So the history lesson was such that this is a history lesson. And so it would not be responsible if I got on here and talked about, I was the one that thought about bullying and homophobic name calling and sexual violence and teen dating violence, always someone before us. 1997, Nan Stein and her colleagues, as well as Barry Rosenbluth, who is just a wonderful, wonderful prevention scientist, practitioner, came up with Expect to Respect, where bully proof was the curriculum that Nan developed. 1997, they were talking about preventing dating abuse by reducing social acceptance of bullying and sexual harassment. So ponder that for some of you that maybe weren't even born yet. I don't know. So, they really did propose multi-level interventions, which is just the norm now. So there was a classroom curriculum. Of course, there was staff training. There was policy development, because remember, we have a federal law against sexual harassment in our schools, Title IX. And so it's not like bullying legislation where there's no federal law and very little guidance, but it's very clear that we need to have a policy and they need to follow that policy, or develop it, or know what it is, know their Title IX coordinator. But parents play a role. And I think parents are increasingly going to have to be in part of our prevention programs, especially given the presence of social media and other influences. So we really do need that parental monitoring piece. And then, of course, support services. We've got victims. Sometimes we look at our data and then we forget these are middle schoolers, these are high schoolers, and they're not just a statistic, but we need to think about if we're able to identify those victims, those perpetrators, they need support services, whether that's individual counseling or some groups, or working with faith-based organizations, other types of things. Certainly, we've talked about some risk, and even the moderators were risky, right? That traditional masculinity and dismissiveness of sexual harassment. But CDC is really with connecting the dots and breaking down those silos and understanding the overlapping protective factors and that are associated with bullying, with sexual violence, as well as teen dating violence. And we had a number of papers the last few years where, with our longitudinal data, we're trying to understand what are the protective factors. And I don't have time to go through all those papers, but I'll just point out in the first, again, binary ways that we looked at sex here. The bottom line are your male perpetrators, and 0 is the beginning of middle school and 5 is in high school. Above that line are the female perpetrators. So we'll just talk about that 2 lines. The bottom line shows that male perpetrators start the lowest in their own self-perceived empathy and perspective taking in middle school. Females a little bit higher there than them. You'll see that the females actually catch up to what would be the male and female non-perpetrators almost, but the boys continue to be the lowest group when we look at that. So this is in some way supports the use of social emotional learning, which is another buzzword that's problematic right now. So let's say workforce development or executive function or life skills. I think we can say life skills. Includes empathy and perspective taking. And we've done some virtual reality work where we were able to increase empathy around bullying and around sexual harassment scenarios with middle school kids. So that's promising. And lots of other examples of where we're trying to build connection and empathy in the schools. Same interpretation for the school belonging. Now, this is going to be critical as we think about the YRBS data that just came out. And they said that school connectedness was the lowest for females, gender and sexual minority youth, and non-white categories of race and ethnicity, so students of color. So that report highlighted very, very clearly what hundreds of our papers have shown, that even when you have that exposure to family violence or the lack of emotion regulation training at home, we can prevent bullying at school, sexual violence, and teen dating violence if we have kids coming to school that have a trusted adult that feel connected. And hopefully you guys are showing that too. This, in some ways, it breaks my heart when I see that with the YRBS because of the tremendous amount of work that's not happening in our schools. And so I'd love to hear some successes that would probably help my distress. Okay, so we have to identify, I think most of our prevention programs within violence has for a while been targeting protective factors, whether that's school climate or trusted adults, or building agency within youth, both in middle school and high school, empowering the youth to do that work. So we could go on. Parental monitoring is critical, as well as really strong adult social support in the school building or outside in a community. We also just most recently had a paper published yesterday where we were looking at sport as a protective factor for bullying and a wellness program for elementary school kids where we had good results. So that's promising too. So to continue to do that empathy and school sense of belonging is going to be critical as we move forward. Luckily, the federal government's providing lots of support to evaluate school-based mental health programs, which are including some of that social emotional learning, but also bullying prevention. But I think that we really do need to think about how can we get in our schools to prevent the sexual harassment and sexual violence, which seems to be increasing, at least in that YRBS, which they looked at the last 19 years. Many of the programs that are out there are really multi-level interventions, right? So we can go to the Veto Violence by CDC, that's more recent, and then we can go all the way back to Nan Stein and Barry Rosenbluth's model. And really, to do this work, as everybody on this call knows, it takes long-term commitment and relationship buildings in the schools and the communities to do this work. It is really staff resource intensive. I often think of Katie Edwards' work at Nebraska, as well as Lindsay's work there in Rhode Island. Sometimes it just makes your head hurt to think about how much we have to do this, but this is intensive. And for some of you that are young scholars, I really encourage you to read a paper that Lindsay, Katie, Jeff Temple, and I wrote called What's Not in the Methods section. And I'm sure Lindsay provided that to you, which was very rewarding to write. And there was so much synergy between the four of us, different challenges we've had doing this work, but it's very, very clear that it is going to be a good primer for those venturing into school-based interventions or community-based interventions, and hopefully those join. Highly collaborative and inclusive. The days of PIs just running in, collecting data and handing over curricula or a framework are over. We're on the ground, we're in there. We have to rely on opportunities and what the communities need. And maybe it takes a few years to convince a particular district or a school that this is where they need to focus their violence prevention efforts, and maybe you have to meet where they're at. And as you build that relationship and the trust, and really pulling in those local champions is so critical. Again, the days of PIs going in and doing violence prevention and not considering all the other things that might be happening in the community or the history with researchers in a particular school or school district, those are far behind. And it makes for a difficult evaluation. So in our Colorado trial, we really drew upon CDC's connecting the dots, right? And so we were measuring bullying and sexual violence and teen dating violence. So we had that covered in the measurement. But we wanted to say, okay, wait a minute. This high school program, Sources of Strength, seems to hit these protective factors and environments that CDC was talking about and connecting the dots. So what did we do? We went in and we implemented in an RCT Sources of Strength for 2 years, 11 high schools, and great debate on the team there to say, should we actually add some specific content around sexual violence? But remember, for connecting the dots, if we're just really addressing those risk and protective factors that are supposed to be overlapping across these outcomes, Sources of Strength had shown that it was effective in building help seeking and school connectedness and reducing suicide attempts, which we did find in our Colorado trial. So we did replicate that finding, but we had no reductions in bullying, sexual harassment, or teen dating violence. And so that calls for the field that perhaps we do have to have specific content for sexual violence to move the needle. It could also just be, as I said before, this all ties in, those sexual harassment, the kids that were engaging in sexual harassment were quite popular. And so did we enlist one of them as a peer leader? Stay tuned on that one. Was it that they avoided that type of, so say someone wanted to talk about the inappropriate touching or language that was happening in a school, but those that were doing it were more popular? We do know that We did see the needle move a little bit in sexual violence and teen dating violence when there was greater exposure to the sources of strength. And that's a paper that's coming out in School Psych Review. So if you ever want to see a paper, if you want to see a paper where there's null findings, look for that paper, and where we really had to dig into our implementation data to say what is happening here. But if I were to do it over again, I would target some component of sexual violence or adolescent relationship aggression. All that to say that it really does, to do this work, and this is why it's been so challenging, is that a lot of our models early on in our programs focused on the individual level, perhaps some of the relationship. And now CDC is really funding those programs, not necessarily in schools, but in the community and society. It'll be interesting because in the report from YRBS, CDC in that report is promoting social emotional learning and more school-based interventions. So interesting conversation, because some of the latest RFPs over the last, 3 or 4 years, you're not allowed to use some of those programs, right, that are already well established. Anyway, we can have more conversation about that. So we really do have to think about this comprehensive approach that addresses the school climate, that contributes to less connection. So we need to think about that, but also thinking about the messaging that we have towards our kiddos. There has to be, as I said, we have to think about involving the leadership of the community members. Again, read our paper. We have to determine the sufficient dosage. I mean, oftentimes we think the sufficient dosage is the three-year grant cycle. And that's not very scientific. And we're seeing briefer and briefer interventions. So it may not even be that 3-year cycle, right? There was something released today that talked about brief social emotional learning, where they're showing, of course, David Yeager's done this work too, that these brief interventions might be something that we want to look at. We still need to focus on interpersonal skills. We are still human and need strong interpersonal skills to manage conflict. Bystander approaches, I still think it's important to think about those norms. And dismantling societal systems of oppression. It was the first time that I was actually allowed by an editor and some reviewers to talk about this need for control and dominance that I had talked about in differently over the years, but was able to just call out the systems of oppression, which are our schools sometimes for. And this, I'm just going to end with this quote that Katie and I worked a long time on, and this is Katie's coming to you guys, and so this is how she thinks as well. So we have to have prevention programming deployed in the schools and other youth serving settings that must disrupt these patterns. Dominance really underlies bullying, sexual violence, and adolescent relationship aggression. How can we disrupt it and make it so that it's not rewarded, so they're not the popular ones? Instead, foster cultures of collective care, empathy, and psychoeducation regarding the ways that oppressive symptoms shape interpersonal interactions. I will stop there. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Thanks, Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Espelage. This was amazing. I have a lot of questions myself, but I know there are other folks here that are just jumping to ask you questions. So if folks want to come on off mute, and I'll do my best to moderate some questions.
Okay. I'm glad I could plug our paper. That was a fun paper.
Yes, thank you.
I have a question for you, Dr. Espelage. So I'm here, like, it seems like I'm just curious with the Expect Respect program, what do you think happened with it? Like, why did it kind of pop up in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then not really go anywhere?
Oh, I didn't say it's
or is it, I guess I'm wondering, I guess my question would be, why haven't I heard about it? Or maybe it's because I'm a ding dong, but
no.
I'm surprised it's not more wide, spread and other things.
I thought it was gone too, Betsy. I thought it was gone. And then Barry reached out to me last year after this review paper. And I was like, Barry, where have you been? And I hadn't seen her for a long time. And if you Google Expect Respect, there's tons of papers on it. So you're not, it just wasn't in that group where people talk about dating matters or shifting boundaries or coaching boys into men, green dot, right? So there's the high flyers there, safe dates. And those are all the programs that CDC will no longer fund evaluations of. Okay, not sure what that's all about, but it's out there. Like it's wild. They've moved into really having 3 tiers. So the bully proofing curriculum is not in there anymore because I don't think that part of the condition worked as well. And then it morphed. This is why I thought it went away, because Nan then joined up with Bruce Taylor and did shifting boundaries, which had a different curriculum in it. And the curriculum didn't work there either. I mean, it was more of the environment, the changes in the environment that did that. So that's why I just thought, oh, it just went into that. But no, Expect Respect, which was originally funded by CDC. But yeah, you just don't hear much about it or see it on the list either. It did pop up in Lisa De La Rue, who's now tenured at San Francisco, when she did her review in 12, gosh, that's been 11 years. Of teen dating violence. It did pop up then, but I had forgot about it. Yeah. So I was going to say they do school-based, but they also do individual counseling. They do campaigns. They do group counseling. Barry actually ran the largest domestic violence shelter community, not even a shelter, like it had a school. It was massive. And so it looks as if they've moved more into community and less into schools, which that is a shift that's happening for many folks. Like Liz Miller just did her last trial, Manhood 2.0 or something. I got that all wrong, in churches. There, yeah. So yeah, because schools are challenging. And in the large, not to depress you, like I don't need to depress people, but in the large scheme of it, a lot of big school districts in this country have moratoriums on research. So, but yeah, Betsy, you're not, I was with you. Yeah. So has everybody read the CDC report? The YRBS report? Yeah. I guess my question though is when you think about 40% of high school students being sad and hopeless, that was 2021. Weren't we all kind of sad and hopeless in 2021? They don't mention like the context, right? So this is, yeah, right. So it's the year prior. So maybe like we shut down in 20. So I think that's an issue. Bullying did go down, which is, and the female, 70% of gender and sexual minority or persistent hopelessness in the past year. And then when I was presenting this in my class this morning, I realized the 19 and 20-year-olds in my class are these people. These are the ones. I said, that explains. I didn't say that out loud, but it explains a lot of just their flat affect, don't want to participate. You know, I was like, this is you guys. Anyway. Other questions, comments, disagree? So think about this. On my way in, before I was coming in here, left my puppy Lindsay to come in here. And I was like, all right, so bullying went down, but sexual assault went up. And here I make an argument. Of course, you've got to remember the YRBS, these are just cross-sectional things that they're looking at trends generally. I think it is disturbing that 14% of girls have been sexually assaulted in the last year. I wonder about where, I don't know, was that happening because there was less parental supervision, monitoring? Where was it happening? You know, that's what the YRBS just leaves you with more questions than answers, I think, sometimes, to unpack that. So if anybody has any thoughts, so I don't.
Shael, I saw you come off mute. Do you have a question?
I do have some thoughts.
Yeah, great.
Well, I think first and foremost, that understanding sexual violence among teens has improved. And so they're reporting that, and again, it's only in the surveys that they're reporting. If we were to hold that survey against the actual reports that school administrators get, it would be like non-existent comparatively. So I think there has been an improvement in understanding consent, like a drastic improvement, and they are learning it predominantly through TikTok. And so their understanding of what constitutes sexual violence is very different than even 2 years ago. So I think that is, to me, like the biggest shift there. But I would also say that piece where like access to reporting and understanding reporting in school, let alone their Title IX rights in school, is non-existent. And I would say that also, like, if you were to compare those two things, like I collect data from every student we work with, asking them about if they know how to report in school, if they know what their rights are in school, and if they feel that their school is providing them with information about healthy relationships and consent adequately. And across the boards, no matter where we go in the US, it's unilaterally like low. It is absolutely, even in like a presentation, we'll be like, okay, who here themselves or a friend has experienced sexual violence or harassment? And like huge hand raises. And then I'm like, okay, keep your hands raised if you knew how to report that in school. Nobody ever keeps their hands up. So it doesn't matter where we go. So I think there is another level of re-victimization and frustration among students, knowing that they themselves probably even better understand consent than most of their school administrators. And so they themselves also understand relationship violence better than most of their school administrators. So again, I think that's another huge gap and a huge piece of why school administrators may maybe shy away from implementing programming that can reduce that, because they're a generation lacking that understanding themselves. So there needs to be a tremendous amount of faculty staff training around Title IX, but also around just healthy relationships, because we make this assumption that adults understand what they are, and they really don't. Like hands down, if you quiz a kid on consent next to an adult on consent, it is really tragic. So I think there even needs to be like thought and uplift about what that adult allyship piece looks like, both parents, but also certainly school administrators, because it's another level of frustration. We saw so many of those, probably not those same kids in that survey, but those kids coming up, watching the kids before them do all these massive walkouts all around the country.
That's right. Yeah.
So I think there is an escalating layer of frustration around both prevention, but certainly response, and that much of the contact that we get to do work in schools is always generated by students. The schools ultimately acquiesce to bringing us in, in response to their students' frustration and anger, and ultimately taking into their own hands, they're making those demands. There are a handful of schools that are doing it preventatively, but most of them are doing it responsively.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So another layer of problems and things to overcome. And I think things to really look at, like, how do we overcome those barriers of being a generation that didn't get this education, working with a generation that's getting it outside of school, but expecting a certain level of protection and response in school.
Oh yeah, we have teachers that are just like, I do not feel comfortable teaching that. I don't have the skills to teach that. Yeah, it's just frustrating.
Well, but I think that's where like peer-to-peer education training is so vital, but also still requires allyship, because that same teacher who might not be comfortable teaching it then has to go, okay, well, I'm comfortable with you teaching it, which is another bit of a boundary. But that's why, again, I think what talking about like unlocking that access to schools, because I take a pretty anarchic approach to entering schools. First and foremost, school clubs are always much easier to get off the ground than any sort of curriculum change. But also, if we're training peer educators outside of school and they're taking that self-selected initiative to become a peer educator, then working with even one adult ally in the building to give them time during advisory periods versus trying to, again, do that curriculum change or integrate into classroom time that otherwise is very strictly guarded, then it's a little bit more of an anarchic approach, but it's still an entry point. And then once that entry point happens, that sort of trickle out effect. But the other problem being like that, continuing that hand down to kids, younger kids in the school, so that it doesn't trickle out once kids graduate.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. It sounds like you've had some success, but it's reactionary. Yeah. But we'll
Depending
take
on,
it, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to post a quick poll.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, I am absolutely delighted that you could spend this time with us, Dr. Espelage, speaking on behalf of the Research to Practice and Policy core of the COBRE and the COBRE as a whole. We really appreciate the time that you took today to share your knowledge with us. And this discussion today and your talk is going to be living on with our COBRE so that all of the scholars that are trained within the program for years to come will be able to access this knowledge. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. We really appreciate the time.
It was good to see you all. It's nice to meet some of you. Keep up the good work. Talk to you later.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.